Welcome back, everybody. We are now at Harvard. We have left MIT and now we've come to Harvard, which might be considered going from rival to rival, but that's what makes it a lot of fun. Today we are meeting with Dr. Dede, who I met while I was in the government and spent some time working with him in a variety of areas focused on education. And what we're going to talk about today is at kind of the strategic level. So a lot of times when we talk about education, we're focused on how do we help teachers get the salaries they need, which does need to be helped. We also talk about different ways that we can do assessments or we can teach in a classroom, all of which are important topics. Additionally, we have to talk about the entire system of education because the country is changing dramatically. And what we're seeing is that people are going to start having different careers throughout the lifetime. I don't just mean jobs, we mean 3 to 6 careers, which means we have to start looking at education, not just at K-12 and not just in the collegiate space or the trade space, but actually all the way through into about age 75. So today we're going to talk about what Harvard calls the 60-year curriculum at this strategic level of planning for our education and learn a little bit about how the system may change in the future. So I'm going to pass it off to you, and why don't you tell us a little bit about your background and what it is that you've been studying in this career piece.
Sure.
What you'll do next will be the next question.
So I am the Timothy E. Worth Professor in Learning Technologies here at the Graduate School of Education at Harvard. And I study all the many ways that technology can help all forms of learning, formal and informal, from early education right through adulthood. And that leads me to think about the strategic level that you're talking about, because I'm not specialized to any particular form of learning or any particular developmental level of schooling. And the 60-year curriculum concept is that in mid-adolescence, we get serious about what our first job might be. We give up on the fireman or the NBA player or the astronaut, and really start to think about how am I going to earn a living. And this next generation is going to live into their 90s or well beyond. So that means that they need to work until their mid-70s to have enough money to retire on. So that's 6 decades. And as you said in the introduction, in those 6 decades, they're not just going to have a single job or a single career. They're going to have multiple careers with different roles within those careers. And some of the careers don't exist yet. So you can't say, well, why don't you prepare me high school or college for the 5 or 6 careers that I'm going to have? We don't know what those careers are, many of them. So how education is set up now is that we spend 95% of our time preparing people for their first job, as if it was going to be their only job. And then we say, well, if you're well off enough to come back and get a master's degree later, or a doctoral degree, or some kind of advanced certificate, then you can be ready for your second career. What we should be doing is thinking about the 6 decades as a pipeline and preparing people for their first job and their first career in a way that also makes them flexible and entrepreneurial and creative enough that they can handle the other careers that don't exist yet that are coming down the road. And that's a fundamental reconceptualization of what we've been doing in education so far.
Yeah, I often say that in education we focus on defining success as getting from one grade to the next grade. And in military, we often define success as we don't really care what you can do in a classroom. What we care is what you can do in the field, right? What you can do in what we call theater. Because in military, it gets real serious real fast. But in K-12, we don't see what someone looks like at 25. So we don't know if they're handling their life situation well. We don't know if they're a happy individual. We don't know if they're prepared to take that next challenge that comes their way, whether that's a job or a life situation. And so we measure what we can. So you mentioned technology, and I think for a lot of people, when they hear technology in education, they think of two things. One, they think of bringing an iPad or a computer into a classroom, or two, they think about replacing a teacher with technology. And I know you're thinking about it in a slightly different way than either of those two. So can you talk a little bit about how that technology can enable this learning across the lifetime?
Well, one thing that I spend a lot of time thinking about is that we're moving into an era where things are happening very fast, largely because of technology, globalization, social media, artificial intelligence, biotechnology, and we need to change the goals of education. So before we worry about changing the methods of education, we need to think about what we're educating for. And I worry because in some ways we're preparing students to compete with artificial intelligence instead of to complement artificial intelligence. We're preparing John Henry to go up against the steam engine.
Yeah.
So for example, students strive to do very well on high-stakes tests like the SAT, the ACT, the GRE. That's exactly the kind of thing that artificial intelligence does really well. It can score really high on tests like that. What artificial intelligence doesn't do well compared to people is more on the creative side, the social emotional side, the entrepreneurial side. And so we need to think about a world in which there's a kind of blended intelligence, where the AI does the simpler things, and that frees people to do the more complicated things, but they can only do that if they have the capacity to do those things. And the education system is still focused on teaching people to be really, really good at the simple things that are not going to be part of the workplace.
So how do we change that?
Well, I think one way to change that is to bring technology into how we teach, because then we can start to model what this blended intelligence looks like in the classroom so that students are prepared when they encounter it in the world. So one of the examples I give in my speeches of the kind of thing that should no longer be part of the curriculum is memorizing the state capitals, because you can look it up in 10 seconds and it's not foundational for any other form of knowledge.
Well, I do know the good song, though, that goes with it.
Yes,
I think I memorized it in 3rd grade and I have not forgotten it.
And I was horrified when my younger daughter came home one day from her very expensive school and said that she was memorizing the state capitals. So it's pervasive.
It is, yes.
On the other hand, something like the periodic table, sure, you can look it up in 10 seconds, but you have no idea what it means, and it is foundational for a lot of higher order knowledge. And you need the kind of blended intelligence where you're not memorizing the table, the machine knows the table, but you're understanding what it means in terms of chemistry and physics and so on. So I think that that's the kind of shift that we need in education, but the system isn't set up for that. In many ways, we still have education that's optimized for the industrial era, where you really were going to have one job all of your life, and that job was essentially doing what a machine can do, not even an artificial intelligence machine, but just a basic machine can do.
Yeah, that's a really big shift to change, and I think what a lot of people imagine, because it is hard to imagine what doesn't yet exist, right? And so what a lot of people ask is, how do we change the methods in the classroom, or how do we then introduce a new subject? And one of the problems that we see is that you're essentially stacking more and more and more rules rather than actually shifting the system. So I have an example I give oftentimes, it's for military, is the Federal Acquisition Regulations book. It's about this thick. And the paper is super, super thin, and the words are very, very small, and it is a set of rules, and they just keep adding to these rules to ensure that fairness will happen. And of course, I often say the only thing that book does is ensure fairness will never happen, because the only people who can work with that book either have enough money to pay somebody who's memorized it, or they enjoy gaming the system enough to work around it, right? And so the fairness goal is eradicated in the method used to try and solve the problem. I feel like we have the same problem happening in education, where we have a lot of folks who are in the decision-making space that have not been educators or have not been in the education system, whether it's research or the classroom. And so the answer is to add a new rule or add a new requirement. If students need to learn more, let's spend more time working on it. And oftentimes we find it's the opposite.
Yeah.
So how do we make this whole system shift when we can't imagine it?
Well, one of the things that the military has been very good about in its training is understanding the value of simulation. And in simulation, you have the opportunity to do rather than to listen, which in itself is a very powerful principle of learning. And you also have the chance to practice doing something that's going to have very high stakes connected with it when you move into the theater or when you move into real life, which is another fundamental principle of learning. So we're very happy that we have flight simulators, because we know that pilots are going to encounter things in the real world that they're not going to encounter just by putting in hours flying an airplane with an instructor sitting next to them. And the simulator can create these unusual situations and let pilots learn how to make split-second decisions and handle them. And a lot of military training is similar in terms of how it works. My colleagues and I build immersive authentic simulations that start as early as 3rd grade.
Wow.
And so in 3rd grade, you can wear the shoes of an ecosystem scientist, and even in the middle of the winter here in Massachusetts, you can enter a virtual environment where you are at a pond in the middle of the summer with your friends, and there's a puzzle that you have to figure out using the tools and practices of ecosystem science. So that's learning by doing. And it's learning something that you're going to apply in the real world eventually as a citizen, if not as an ecosystem scientist. And it's giving you the chance to kind of practice and develop skills like collaboration and making arguments from data that are also very valuable things in the real world. Now, if you look at the curriculum, maybe you get the chance to practice making arguments from data at the end of high school, but that's too late. We should be starting to do that at 3rd grade, and believe me, 3rd graders can do it. What we did, just to clarify how much 3rd and 4th graders can do, is we added the immersive authentic simulation computational modeling. So the students are observing species in the environment, and then they go into a modeling tool, and they have a chance to build programs that replicate those behaviors, and so they understand them more deeply because they're thinking through the behavior, not just observing the behavior. And 3rd and 4th graders are eating this stuff up. So I think where we need to move in education is to use technology not to stuff more and more facts into students, but instead to create these opportunities to learn by doing, with guidance from the technology, but also with guidance from the teacher, with time inside things like virtual worlds, but also time outside of things like that, talking with your friends, talking with the teacher, figuring things out, figuring out what to do when you go back into the virtual world. And I hope that we'll see a lot more modeling and simulation in education as we get smarter about how to do this. And perhaps we can even simulate some of those careers that don't exist yet, because after all, in a virtual world, you can do all sorts of things you can't do in the real world.
It's absolutely true. So it's almost like we want to shift from learning information to creating capabilities. Not just the skill of doing something, but the competency of thinking.
Yes, exactly. I struggle with this even with my graduate students at Harvard. So I have some students who are very, very smart and dedicated, and I cherish them. but they have come straight through without ever having any real world experience, just moving up the academic food chain, and they've gotten all the way to Harvard. And they're puzzled by the fact that I'm not doing what their other teachers have done. And they come and talk to me about it, and they're very polite, but basically what they're saying is, you're supposed to tell me the truth, and I'm supposed to write it down, and I'm supposed to give it back to you, and then you certify that I'm a really smart person. And that's what education is. And you keep asking us what we think. You know, why are we paying you money to ask us what we think? And of course the answer that I give them very politely is, sure, I could do that, but 5 years from now it wouldn't be true anymore, and you can't afford to come back to Harvard for another degree. So what I'm doing is something much more important, is I'm teaching you how you figure out what's true, as opposed to simply accepting what's true from whoever is telling you that as if they know. And that means that I'm not preparing you for further schooling, which is based on knowledge accumulation. I'm preparing you for life, which is based on figuring out uncertainty and complexity and coming up with new knowledge. And that's appropriate for a master's degree, because most of the students are going to go straight from the master's degree into life. It's more complicated earlier in schooling, because you can do what we're doing with these immersive authentic simulations, but it's not on the tests. And so, you know,
this is
we
where we
have
get to the
change
system
the
problem.
Assessments. Yes.
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 Yes. So that's where my head was going. Was I imagine if we were to poll people, that the vast majority would say, I love it. Yes, obviously we need to have people ready for life, ready for jobs of the future and the careers that they will have subsequently that we haven't yet come up with. And that sounds great until you get into a room, and I know this well from government, and it also brings in politics, is you get in that room and you have to make decisions. And those decisions get made on things like, how did you score on something so we know how to allocate money? And those decisions come down to, how do we build the right number of buildings and hire the right number of teachers if students are gaining these capabilities at different rates? So this is a problem that the military has asked, and I got really pressed on, was, well, how do we figure all this funding out if we have this set up as a 20-week course and some people finish it in 8? Where do they go? I'm sure we can all imagine a student who at 12 years old probably could have completed calculus. Where do they go from there? They're not ready to go to college because they're 12.
Exactly.
So they're not developmentally ready. We don't typically get, that's of course on the one end, but 16 is not hard to imagine. And a lot of times, I know in my hometown, and certainly I was recommended, go to the community college. I said, community colleges are great, but it's a particular kind of education.
Yes.
And it was not going to fit a 16-year-old who's this, a big holistic thinker. Alternatively, you have people who maybe need till 21, 22.
Mm-hmm.
What difference does it make if you learn everything you need to by 22 versus 18? Does it matter? Does it matter?
You're highlighting another way that technology can help with this educational systemic problem, which is personalization. So we not only have an industrial era education system in its goals, preparing people for a workplace that doesn't exist anymore, we also have an industrial educational system in its methods, because what we do is what you do on the assembly line. You have a one-size-fits-all process, and you keep the amount of processing constant, and so some things are made properly and some things are not made properly, and you reject them. Except the 50% failure rate in education. No person would run an assembly line at that level of failure rate, so it really makes no sense at all. In personalization, you say, well, let's vary the amount of processing. And that means varying the amount of time, which gets back to what you're saying. And we know that people are incredibly different in their strengths and incredibly different in how they learn, so it really makes sense means somebody might learn math 50% faster than the typical student, but they might learn history 50% slower than the typical student. So that's a recipe for disaster in one size fits all, because you're bored out of your mind for half of the time and overwhelmed the other half of the time. But if we can personalize learning, then you master in the amount of time that it takes. You use competency-based rather than seat time-based measures to determine when somebody's ready to move on. And then the time is available to help you with things that are stretch for you, either because you're slower at doing them or because you're ready for something harder that takes you out of the normal range, but is a great capacity for you to build.
Now that sounds great in theory, but I know there are people who think, okay, how does this work in a classroom if a teacher has to personalize everything for every student?
Well, my hero in educational technology is actually Maria Montessori. And ironically, she was pre-digital, so her classrooms were full of technology, but it was analog technology. It was wood and water and other kinds of physical manipulables. And if you've watched kids in a Montessori classroom, it's very personalized. The kids are choosing what they work on, but they get guidance from the teacher if they spend too much time working in an unbalanced way. And it's the opposite of one size fits all. So the kids are working on what they need to work on to help them get to the next developmental stage. And they're also learning agency and self-efficacy, which are very important skills for adults because they're part of the decision-making process. Now, what the problem with the non-digital classroom is that all those physical manipulatives are in fact very expensive, and it's not easy for a teacher to learn how to handle all of that and remember everything that every child is doing. So the technology can help by both making some of the experiences digital, like the virtual ecosystem that I mentioned, and then also collecting streams of data that can be analyzed and given to the teacher so that the teacher isn't overwhelmed by what every kid is doing second to second, but the teacher is getting overall patterns that help them understand that Jane is bored because she's moving too slowly in this subject, and Bobby is overwhelmed and needs some supports in order to keep going. So I think that technology used well can provide a rich kind of information system that then the teacher can make the decisions about.
So to close this out, I wanted to ask, what are 2 to 3 things that the system needs to have to, one, be able to change to this kind of a picture where the technology is an enabler and support system, but 2, that helps Americans recognize that education is going to go beyond the classroom that we imagine today, right? That it's going to progress to that lifelong space. What kinds of 2 maybe system level things do we need? Just planting the seeds, right?
Sure.
What are those pieces we need to think about?
I think one system level thing is for all of us as a society to discuss what it's going to mean for the next generation to live in a global civilization where you're partners with an artificial intelligence in your work, and where your world is changing more profoundly every 5 years than your grandparents' world changed during their entire lifetime. That's a very rich and interesting discussion, and nobody has all the answers, but it's very helpful to get people to understand what really matters. And then a second thing would be to shift from this industrial model of one-size-fits-all information accumulation, high-stakes tests, to more active learning, whether simulation-based or maker spaces or many of the other ways that technology can be used to enhance active learning, coupled with performance-based assessments so that you're moving along based on what you can actually do rather than what you can regurgitate or how long you've been doing something. And that's a big shift for people because the tendency is to say, well, look at me, I'm doing well as an adult, and I had that old education system, so what's wrong with it? Why fix it if it isn't broken? Well, it's a different world that our children are entering now, and we have different capabilities than we had when we were growing up in education. So I think if we can do those two things, we can collectively try to get some leverage on these systemic problems.
I love it. Thank you so very much.
Thank you.